Good morning, everyone. It's 9 a.m. on Wednesday, March 11th. Welcome to our fourth workshop in the series of workshops providing stakeholder input to PNM's 2026 Integrated Resource Plan, or the IRP. This is Margie Tatro with GridWorks. I'm joined by my GridWorks colleagues, Kathy Boyce and Deborah Shields, the facilitators for this workshop. And we're so grateful for all of you being here and very grateful for the work done to date by the PNM team and their consultants to prepare for this conversation and others. We are recording this workshop, and the material as well as recording will be loaded on the GridWorks website along with other materials as usual. Our focus today is preparing for stakeholder requested modeling runs. This is a multi-step process, but our objectives today are first to update participants on many activities that have occurred since workshop number 3. We want to inform participants about the status of modeling activities, share the stakeholders' keen interests and core interests in modeling runs, and understand the process for proposing stakeholder ideas for additional model runs. As I mentioned, this is not the only conversation around stakeholder model runs, and we will be telling you more about how the more formal process for ideas will be handled. So after our introduction and responses from PNM about some things that they're doing currently, we'll have a conversation about modeling run interests summarized and adjourned by noon. The next slide shows a little bit about our activities for today. Most of you already know how to use the WebEx tools of sharing your microphone on the mute, keeping that perhaps off until you're speaking. The video camera will show your camera. The raise hand button will allow you to raise and lower your hand. And the chat is that little balloon button on the lower right of your screen. So those are all tools hopefully you're all familiar with at this point. A couple of workshop norm reminders on the next slide. Please, during presentations, we'd ask you to hold questions until the Q&A sessions. Reminder that this stakeholder process is for input. It's not a litigated proceeding. So thank you all for continuing to be so respectful in your comments, working with good intentions and giving each other the benefit of the doubt, sharing your ideas, but also leaving time for others. I see we have over 40 participants in our meeting today. So though you may not see all of their pictures on your screen, be conscious that there are many more people in the meeting than you might be aware of. The next slide shows some things that have happened since workshop number 3 in February. And we greatly appreciate everyone's engagement in these follow-up conversations. There was a transmission office hour on February 17th. We had 47 stakeholders attend that. And the purpose was really to share the information that PNM had prepared for workshop number 3 that we didn't have time to address. So there were several questions answered and several other documents, including the Grid Enhancing Technologies white paper and PNM's 20-year transmission outlook that are shared with folks for their review. The second office hour was on geothermal costs conversations on March 4th. We had 50 stakeholders attend that, and there were some actions that came out of that, including adding hydrothermal as one of the geothermal resource options, offering the possibility of a geothermal cost and timing sensitivity as a stakeholder requested modeling run, and identification of the best locations for geothermal projects in the future for New Mexico and for PNM service territory. Let me offer a correction that we made, facilitators made an error in that was pointed out to us after that office hour. There was conversation about including some suggested language for future RFPs regarding geothermal. We'd just like to remind stakeholders that any bid language recommendations for future RFPs are handled under a separate proceeding that's managed by the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission regarding RFPs. So future RFP language considerations will be part of different proceedings outside of the IRP conversation. The third office hour that was hosted on March 11th was to follow up on the many excellent questions that we had from stakeholders that just didn't have time to be responded to in the previous workshops. We had 30 attendees at that particular office hour, and there are written responses to 25 questions that were posted, and then discussion of anything that needed follow-up was included in that office hour. And there was dialogue amongst people to try to reach clarity on some outstanding questions. I'd like to point out there were a few questions that arose there that will be addressed in today's workshop. So thank you for participating in those. We think it was good to be able to follow up on topics of people's interest outside of the full workshops. There are recordings of each of these office hours on the GridWorks website. We did not create written summaries of those, but you're free to listen to the recordings if you would like. Okay, so with that, I would like to turn the microphone and camera over to the PNM team to give some updates. There's some stakeholder question responses, there's information about the venue, site materials, update and modeling, and then also we'll kick off the conversation that will be had in more detail about stakeholder modeling runs. So Tom, I'd like to turn over the microphone to you if you'd like to share your screen and continue with your presentation.
Yeah, all right. Can you see that presentation now?
Yes, thanks, Tom. Looks great.
And can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Let me get out of that for just a sec. But yeah, I don't have my camera on. I'll go ahead and start that and then go back to sharing. All right. Well, welcome to the fourth workshop for PNM's 2026 IRP. We're providing very limited new information today. We were planning to present some initial model results, but we're not quite there yet. So we're continuing to work on that. Those would have been largely on the base cases and then followed in another workshop by some of the sensitivity side of the base cases. So this will provide some additional time. We're still trying to respond to some stakeholder comments and requests, which we'll cover a little bit today, and then still have some others we're trying to follow up on that have been received. We touch on the availability of databases and access to Encompass software today. And then we review, I go over quickly what data is available on Venue, just to remind people, and then to also point out what has changed since the original posting on February 11th. The information we tend to share at the workshops and presentations are fairly high level, covering the key aspects of inputs and results of the IRP. The information on Venue gets into quite a bit more detail for people who are interested in that information. And then we'll also provide some information on what we're thinking in terms of how stakeholders would go about making a stakeholder request. All right, so the first thing I wanted to just touch on is software and database access. Encompass can be made available with the limitations on doing that. So we would provide the Encompass zonal access to the Encompass zonal model. Organizations will need to try to select an individual for access. We're very limited in how many people can really be in there on that. They would need to sign a PNM computer access agreement, and procedures will need to be completed and followed. The ability to use this software or work with the data structure requires experience. PNM is not in a position to provide training or support to help with that. We would be limited to making sure you had access to it. And to get access, parties will need to contact PNM at this address, irp@pnm.com, indicating you'd like software access and provide a phone number. We will contact you to discuss that. There are several things that we'll need to walk through in that discussion. Identifying who will run the model. This involves getting details associated with getting them a login ID for the PNM network. There'll be PNM ID application and network NDAs will be required to be signed and sent to us. Approval depends on user accepting network computing NDA and then being approved by our BTS department. We will have to work out some assignment of network access because to use the model, you'll need some access to databases, virtual desktop environment, and Office Suite to work with Word or Excel, particularly Excel. And then once assignment of resources is completed, the user, the stakeholder, will be notified to make a request to the PNM service desk for login credentials and future instructions for required steps for logging into the computer environment. So there's a fair amount involved in that, but we will provide that to users who feel they have the experience and can use the software. In terms of databases, we'll make the Encompass database available, as well as the output summaries in Excel format, which will be placed on the confidential venue site. That is pretty much what we did on the last 2023 IRP process. So that information is available there. And then for SurvM, if people are really interested in it, those can be provided in a CSV format. And if you happen to be a user who actually licenses SurvM, an executable version can be obtained from PowerGem, which we would notify them that you would like the executable version. PNM does not run SurvM in-house for the IRP, and we do not have it set up on a platform to provide access. We basically have SurvM analysis done through a consultant with that. All right, moving on. So this is just reviewing some of the slides really were presented in the February 11th workshop, but this is just to remind people that this information is available out there on Venue. It provides the modeling, statistics, costs, parameters, and other things for both our existing plants and for the different projects that can be selected in developing a capital expansion plan in the IRP process. So you've got things like your nuclear and coal costs, fixed O&M for the plant, the fuel cost, parameters for solar, including the cost of our contracts and PPAs. You included out there a fair amount on what we're modeling for geothermal. There's some additional data sheets and other folders, new resources, information, the topology of the zonal model in terms of how the zones are modeled between PNM areas as well as the market, EE bundle characteristics. In the transmission tab, we have added some additional mileage information for stakeholder requests in that one since the February 11th meeting. And this workbook, these workbooks should be by the name you see on there, modeling framework and assumptions. This will include financial modeling assumptions. It discusses the futures and sensitivities we've presented in several workshops and we'll quickly review again today. ELCC values for the different technologies, both average and incremental, have been added to the ELCC tab since February 11th. Our RPS requirements, CO2 emissions targets, and basically what we use for when we have to inflate values. There's no new updates to the commodity price and load table at this point, but they will include load forecast, demand and energy information. We're using hydrogen pricing that comes into play at the end of the 20-year period. The energy prices, gas prices, and carbon pricing we're using. So some things that have been added out there is some work papers on EE and DR that stakeholders can be viewed. This is in a folder marked Energy Efficiency and Demand Response folder. And those go over the different EE and DR programs that will be modeled. There was some requests for some plots or graphs on the demand and energy for the load forecast. Those are in a separate workbook out there by the name you see. There was a request for PNM grid enhanced technology implementation. We had a white paper that was available. That was posted on the GridWorks website a couple of weeks ago, I believe. And then we've also got that out on Venue now for people to access there. In the generic resources folder, where we're keeping the technology data sheet, there has been data sheets added for hydrothermal, geothermal. The previous information is still there on the EGF geothermal. But we're planning to add hydrothermal as an option in the IRP for supply side resources that can be added. We just posted a corrected EE and DR potential study. These were basically because the table of contents wasn't aligning with the report. So that was updated and corrected. And then there was reference in Appendix A and Appendix B to some worksheets that actually did not get included in the study. And that has been corrected now as well. So those should be not much of a change really to it other than those three changes there. And then we've added a load forecast information folder to try to cover some of the things, particularly Anna Summers was requesting, but it includes some work papers for load to try to understand the load components added or subtracted from our CTP base forecast to get to the higher economic growth and the low economic growth forecast. And then some work papers on the probabilities used, the economic variables and regression used in the different rate classes for forecasting. So today we're not sharing new model results. Review of the initial results has taken longer than expected. We will be making Encompass base case and output summaries available on Venue when we have those available. And then we will review results in base case futures and sensitivities in the April workshop. I think I'm going to jump ahead and I'll come back to this here, but some of the questions from stakeholders that were not yet addressed are shown. These were added just this morning, so if you picked up the slide deck before that, you may not have them. Well, we had the request for the energy and capacity projection, the stack bar chart. That was the information I just mentioned had been added to Venue, and that was back added the week of the March 5th office hours meeting. So hopefully people have had a chance to go back and look at that. There was a question on our workshop 3, slide 17, asking if what we had there was a demand or supply. It's basically showing the load for a typical peak day. I believe it was in the year around 2045, and there was a request to understand whether it was demand or supply, and it's basically a demand plot that was built up by the different rate classes that are out there. And then there was acronyms used to identify those rate classes, and I'm just providing here what those rate classes are, what those abbreviations stand for. So the price curves we're using should be available on Venue. Those have been out there for pretty much through all of February. If there's something you're looking for different than that, you'd have to let us know. We haven't resolved this question on the LCC model. We're not sure we fully understand this and wanted to follow up, but this question came from the geothermal workshop. And then, as I just noted, the statistics for load forecasting, there's a whole folder that's been added out there with information on the load forecast. And the slides earlier point to where that is on the Venue site. And then one last question here. I believe this was sent in earlier. I'm not sure which workshop this was, but it was asking about what we're doing with combustion turbines, basically either added or existing at the end of the 20-year time frame in terms of assumptions on conversion to hydrogen. And basically, we are assuming that certain plants won't be converted that are existing today, but anything new that would come in as a potential supply side option would be converted to hydrogen so that we were at carbon zero in 2045. And the assumptions have a cost to convert that's included in the modeling data for the project. It also has a carbon or a hydrogen price that is estimated, assuming the best information we have. That pricing was provided to us by our price forecasting by Siemens that we're using there. And this answer will provide a little more detail on that, but essentially we are assuming a cost for conversion and then switching to a hydrogen fuel at the end of the period. The assumptions are fairly punitive. We're putting all that conversion cost really in the last year, which makes the conversion a fairly punitive alternative over other possible selections. All right. So going back and talking about the framework, we presented this and we'll continue to use it as kind of a guide as we go through the stakeholder process.
Hey, Tom. Taking a little time to get there.
Okay. It looks like we have an update delay on.
Yeah, you missed half of that last question, just so you know.
Okay.
Like you talked through it, but they didn't see it, I don't think. I was waiting for it to refresh.
It's refreshed on your screen.
So we did see that slide with the hydrogen cost question.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Yep. And let me just pause. Deb, do we now have this slide deck posted on the GridWorks website? All right, she's taking care of something else. As soon as we have it available, and I'll have asked Deb to put a link in the chat to folks for this updated slide deck. Thank you. Go ahead. Sorry, Tom.
Okay. So anyway, on the framework, we're defining that we'll be looking at three futures, which is the current trends and policies built around the expected load forecast, then a high economic growth future, and then a low economic growth future. And these kind of show what parts of the forecast are adjusted for those particular futures or what other parameters are considered in them. In the sensitivities, then the chart on the bottom shows really what sensitivities are we going to run on each future? Are we proposing to run on each future? And just going through the ones for the current trends and policies, that includes all of the sensitivities. Then the high economic growth and low economic growth, only look at a portion of those sensitivities. The high electric, the first one there, of course, says none. That just means we run all of our base assumptions there. The high electric vehicle sensitivity would look at a higher penetration of electric vehicle, a faster adoption of electric vehicles in the load forecast. The time of use will look at some sensitivities around data received. during the forecast, looking at the effects of time of use. These transmission projects will be added to try to understand what role they play, if any, in trying to improve PNM market access, as well as the dispatch of our overall portfolio if we have more transmission in there. Mariathol is a project that connects eastern New Mexico with tie to PNM, and then it connects into Arizona from there. Sunzia is similar, although it's a project that's in service today. It started transmitting power last year from eastern New Mexico wind, basically, to Arizona. And this looks at a tie between PNM system in eastern New Mexico and the AC collector systems for all the wind that connects to Sunzia. We're looking at a Blackwater tie that would expand connections to SPP, or really restore and expand connections between PNM and the Southwest Power Pool to see what benefits that might have. That would allow for some arbitrage with a market we really don't have access today. And then Four Corners, looking at additional capacity between PNM's Albuquerque Load Center and Four Corners. The eighth sensitivity there looks at what happens if long duration storage maturity is delayed, taking longer than expected. So you would make that option available later, and the base forecast will be no new natural gas would be basically just that. There wouldn't be options to pick natural gas in there. To understand whether there's remaining significant impacts to getting to carbon zero, we're looking at a no ETA and an ETA 400 limit as sensitivities in there. And then the last one, our base assumption assumes there is no carbon tax based on current federal rule, but it assumes that the tax would be added, and see what the effect of that is in 2030. So in terms of going into what we would do for stakeholder requests, we would try to set up a framework where we're working with the futures and sensitivities. We got stakeholders that pick one of the futures and select a sensitivity that they were interested in working with. And then we would ask them to select a attribute that they were proposing to modify. They would need to provide us a decent description to understand what that attribute is. But these are sort of the categories that we're thinking the attributes fit into, either different demand drivers, different options, supply side and load side for serving that demand, and then different sensitivities around, or attributes around, the different commodities like the gas pricing, market pricing, carbon tax, and then there's the option to consider others as well. We would have to provide a form for collecting this information. The form would look at requesting which stakeholders are interested in this scenario, provide a description of the purpose of the scenario, note the future and sensitivity selected, and then the attribute to be changed in the description of what is needed there. And then there's certain guidance here on things that can be changed fairly readily. On the left side there, you'll see inputs and attributes that can be chosen fairly quickly. The data is set up and available for modifying those different things, picking the different gas forecasts, excluding or including additional technologies, depending in a sensitivity, changing the capital cost, changing the availability dates. Those things are all fairly quick and easy to look at in these sensitivities. Potential CO2 pricing, including, excluding that. And then there's attributes that we want more of a heads up on if people are interested in them, but trying to build in different EE programs or bundling differently could take some time if they're interested in looking at that. And we would have to determine whether it was feasible to do that during the IRP process. But the ones in the middle are ones that require some additional work in building the data to probably model. And then on the right side, we are identifying certain things that cannot be changed from a stakeholder request. They're very core to the whole process and would stay there. So the futures that we're looking at will still remain the 3. Reliability requirements, meeting the ELCCs, the planning reserve margin, and all that stuff isn't really something we can change because they set the key parameters of what's being defines an adequate portfolio. Financial assumptions are generally not something that can be changed, and the study period for this is fixed as 26 to 45. So at this point, I don't really have anything further. I think we can go ahead and see what questions there are out there.
Yeah, thanks again to Thomas, Dwayne, and the team from PNM for being helpful in our preparation for today. Deb, if you'd please show our slide number 7 at this point to let what our process is for. I see we'll have a couple of hands. Hold off just a moment while we describe what's going to happen. We have about an hour scheduled now for questions that people have that we will call on you. If you raise your hand, we'll call on you to please state your question. And if you can also activate your camera at that time, it would be great. If time doesn't allow for all questions to be voiced and answered today, we have a process now. If you can submit any additional questions you have from today by email to irp@pnm.com, please also copy info@gridworks.org. If you can submit those questions by 5 p.m. on this Friday, the 13th, we will work with PNM to come up with responses that will be posted on the Gridworks website by the 20th of March. That's next week. And then we will see an announcement later today for an office hour session on the 25th of March from 1:30 to 2:30 to be able to do any follow-up questions on those previously submitted questions that will be answered on the 20th. So we've put this as a new part of our process. We recognize that there are questions that we may not be able to get to, but we have also, as you see, allocated about the next hour for questions on the material that Tom has just presented. So with that, Deb, you can take down our slide here and let's ask for those who have questions. I see Tom Sullivan and Anna Summer. Anna, would you like to go first? And then we'll go to Tom for his question. Anna, please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Margie. I had a few questions. One was on the discussion of providing Encompass and Servum access to stakeholders. Is the intent that if someone wanted to run simulations in Encompass, that you would need to go through this process of getting access to your internal server, or are you envisioning that as a requirement regardless of how you're accessing and using the model?
Yeah, you would have to go through getting access to the servers we have set up. So that would be something where you go through a process that you can log into that and then run Encompass in a virtual environment.
And I think that's the same way it's been provided in your staff.
Yeah, it's similar to how it's been done in the past.
So maybe I'm still confused though, because you said in your slide that you'll also post the Encompass model and your outputs on the venue site. Is that
We
right?
will provide the Encompass database. That gets exported in an Excel format. It provides all of the data stored in the database, and then the output summaries are the results of your simulations, your runs, your capital expansion plan that comes out of those. And that stuff's all just an Excel format file.
Right. So I guess I'm not clear, like what would be on the server that we couldn't get through the Encompass model that you'll post on Venue?
It would give you the ability to actually run the program if that's what you wanted.
Okay, but for those of us who already have an Encompass license, then that step wouldn't be necessary.
Probably not. I don't
Okay.
think you'd even want to go through that hassle.
Yeah,
Okay.
you could just get the instance and load it into your database and run.
The files that will be on Venue can be loaded back into an Encompass if you already have the program.
Okay, yep, that would be my expectation, but just wanted to clarify that. And then on the Servum access, can we reach out to PowerGem now? And is Nick Wintermantle the person to contact?
What are you looking for there? Do you have something in particular to run? Are you trying to get the database?
Trying to get the database, trying to get the block file.
Okay. Is Servum a program you currently license?
It is.
Okay. We will touch base with PowerGem and see how they want to follow up, but I think they'll probably try to work directly with you then.
Okay,
But we have to give them authorization to release the database they use for PNM.
yep, okay, that sounds good. Thank you. I have some other questions. Margie, should I sort of fall back in line or just keep asking questions?
Yeah, Anna, let's take Tom Solomon's, and then if we don't have other hands raised, we'll come back to you. But let's go to Tom for now, and then we'll come back. Thank you. Tom Solomon, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Margie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. My question goes back to one that you covered pretty well about the hydrogen option, converting combustion turbines at the end of the time frame to combust hydrogen and the prices that you're using. And I guess my question is, have you or your source of the hydrogen cost information updated those modeling parameters since the passage of the 2025 HR1 budget bill, which made very substantial changes to the federal funding levels for clean hydrogen? For example, they accelerated by 5 years the expiration of the 45V clean hydrogen production tax credit. It now expires in December 2027 instead of December 2023. And funding was pulled back and actually canceled for 2 hydrogen hubs so far, with discussions ongoing about possibly canceling the others. So without that level of federal support for hydrogen production, I really challenge whether there's going to be any available third-party supply of green hydrogen in the time frame that you're talking about to use for combustion turbines, which would mean that PNM would have to shoulder the full cost, potentially of about $5 billion in CapEx, to create the infrastructure to generate that amount of green hydrogen, because it is so inefficient to use as a combustion fuel. So that's my question. Hello?
Yeah, the assumptions around the hydrogen conversion are certainly, there's a lot of uncertainty there. Some of the things, your question there, actually, if you could put some of that in writing and send it to us, we can follow up with our consultants and see what level they feel they've incorporated those things. But with that information far out, we haven't tried to really refine some of the assumptions around hydrogen conversion and what can happen in that time frame. The previous IRP, we did look at having electrolysis, the electric supply to actually do that. We chose not to go there until there's really more information available on how the ability and access to hydrogen is progressing. So we appreciate and understand your concerns there. But in the IRP process, most of those things come in at the very end of the process and don't really influence it that much up front. And there'll be other IRPs where I mean, that'll get revisited in each IRP cycle as we go along, and those timeframes get closer.
Okay,
let-
my concern is that it influences whether whether the investment in new gas generation capacity is a real viable use of investment dollars. Because if you can't convert those new gas plants that your, PNM's IRP is planning to build in the next number of years, if you can't convert them to hydrogen in 2024, 2045, that truncates the amortization timeframe for that asset to end in 2045, because the ETA will be in place and it will be illegal to use them. And so that means that the cost that you use to model that scenario of investing in new gas really needs to be investigated and understood if the conversion to hydrogen scenario is really just not viable, which I think it is not.
So Tom, let me ask that we bring this back in our conversation after the break in case it
Okay, sure.
informs a sensitivity model run that you and others perhaps would like to suggest that looks like at an alternative model for hydrogen cost assumption. So let's bring that back as a possible conversation, Dwayne, unless you feel like it should be addressed in a different way. So Tom, Dwayne, back to you for any other response before we move to other questions.
No, I was gonna do exactly what you did, Margie, suggest that we would certainly be willing to look at that in a stakeholder requested scenario, that a different, the inability to use hydrogen at the end of the cycle period, what would that mean in terms of the expansion plan?
Thank you. And I posted my the text of my scenario in the chat, so you have it there. I
Great.
could email it to you because it has the original version has some links that might be useful. I can do that if you like.
Yeah, that'd be
All right.
fabulous. Thank you. Great, thank you. I see Anna Linden Weller and Gwen have their hand up, and then we'll go back to Anna Summers after those two. So Anna Linden, please go ahead.
Hi. So I'm going to try to not ask Gwen's question. I think I know what Gwen's question is, coworkers, but mine is around another pricing scenario, and that is on high gas prices. And obviously, no one knew 2 weeks ago what our government would attempt to do in the Middle East. But given the enormous amount of destruction of infrastructure that the conflict in Iran is creating, and the shortages of LNG supply in Asia and Europe as a result. I mean, obviously, we produce a lot of natural gas here. We're not as subject to that price shock as other parts of the world, but considering the actual destruction of infrastructure in the Middle East, this is likely to not be a short-term shock, but a long-term problem. And I'm wondering if PNM has begun to consider what the inputs to their high gas price scenario should be, and how tightly linked to the global LNG market those gas prices are going to be, and whether PNM would be considering, and again, I understand this has just happened, thinking about what a extended shortage of LNG for US use would do to pipeline gas prices, and therefore your gas price forecast.
Yeah, I'm not sure we can fully address the current situation, and there's opinions that it won't be that long lasting, as well as others that are similar to yours. We do have a high gas price forecast that is well above what we are seeing today, and even our base forecast actually has fairly significant high gas prices in it. And a lot of that seems to be tied to the belief that the electric industry is trying to take on a lot of these large loads out there in many different places, that the supply for that, getting the supply there quickly and reliably, has got a lot of utilities looking at natural gas to add that. So in the pricing forecast, our consultant has indicated that they've tried to look at supply and demand things. A lot of them are pretty short term and changing quickly in the prices they've given us. So there's that phenomena built in, and they've also factored in that there's high demand for U.S. exports of gas, which will put pressure on the pricing as well. So that is in our forecast now. You might take a look at those. The pricing's on Venue, and just see.
Thank you. Yeah, I will absolutely do that. I just wanted to bring it up since it has developed over the time since we last got to talk. I have one other sort of general question, and that is about the things that are changeable and the things that are not changeable in a stakeholder request for modeling. And I understand your division of what is a thing we can request and what is a fixed item, and it makes sense to me. My one question really is about when you say that static input and assumptions includes the futures, and that makes sense that there are 3 futures that you're modeling. Does that staticness also assume what elements you have selected to go into those futures? So for example, I still have a sort of ground truthing issue with having the behind the meter solar forecast be low in the high economic growth scenario, because I don't think that would happen if high economic growth is also increasing economic development, building electrification, EV adoption, et cetera. I understand why you have chosen to have behind the meter solar be low in that scenario, because it makes the scenario more extreme for what you're looking at. And that makes sense to me. But scenarios aren't real and the world is. So I'm wondering if, when you say that the futures you selected are part of the fixed section, are adjusting what makes up those futures also fixed, or could we request a version of the high economic growth scenario where there was also high solar penetration behind the meter, or something similar?
Yeah, the answer to your question there is yes. You can make that request, and that's something we can deal with. In the files that were put out there in the load forecast folder, you might want to take a look at those. There's 2 files that have the word waterfall in them, and they sort of show how we go from the base forecast to build up to the HEG and the LEG forecast. You can there's several columns in there that kind of talk about what are the components added to the base, like high EV, and what does that add if you put high EV in there. So there's several columns that show what the assumption changes are. We can mix and match those columns pretty much any way people want to get the other futures. So you could take the high electric vehicle, for instance, and include that in a different future as a stakeholder scenario request.
Thank you. That's very
So
helpful.
you might want to take a look at those. The 2 files that you really want to look at have the word waterfall in the file name.
Got it. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Anna Linden.
And I have a really quick question. So I think, Anna Linden, for your question about the gas prices, I'm really interested to know how you're thinking about tariff in that same capacity, and how you're thinking about supply chain costs for equipment, materials, components, elements, those kinds of things, which will all be impacted as well. So what's your thinking on all of that? I understand you see a direct impact to gas prices, but it's not exclusively that. It's across a really broad range of impacts in the near term.
Uh-huh.
What's your thinking? What are you planning to do with all of those?
I honestly, I wouldn't have a good answer for you right this minute. I do think it's much bigger than gas prices. That was just the first thing that came to mind. That I mean, I think in general it makes a lower economic growth scenario more likely than a higher economic growth scenario, given increased price pressure on many things, including just basic infrastructure and supplies and freight and et cetera. So it was the first lever I thought of that would be a way to demonstrate that. But there are certainly other levers, and it would be lovely to continue the conversation.
Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think I'm with you that there are so many variables at play today. Understanding what those do in 2030, 2035, 2040, 2045 get very difficult and to really rationalize. And I think in terms of the scenarios, what I'm thinking about is trying to create a box, right? Where are the edges of the box? Where you have points inside the box feel less material to me. I think trying to define what the possible range of futures could be feels like at least what we're trying to do. And I'd love to see scenarios from stakeholders that are testing the edges of the box as much as they are trying to think about moving over 1 inch inside the box. Does that make sense?
That absolutely does. I think you will likely get your wish.
Yep, thanks, Lori. And we're going to continue this conversation after break about what those interests, keen interests from stakeholders will be for modeling runs. Let's go to Gwen, then Anna Summers, then Brian Turner. So Gwen Farnsworth, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I just was going to support Tom Solomon's discussion on hydrogen and the additional costs that should be included, especially if the assumption is that gas generation can continue to operate after 2045. Like the hydrogen cost assumption is critical, and there is information available about those costs, and so it should be modeled. And I just wanted to add another element of the capital costs related to hydrogen that utilities may be responsible for in their own rate base is pipeline delivery of hydrogen and also storage. If the to store the hydrogen fuel closer to the generation capacity or closer to utility operations. So I just wanted to add those two things and understanding that it will be discussed later. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Gwen. Sounds like you and Tom might be helpful in defining an alternative hydrogen cost future, though. So thank you. Anna Summers, let's go back to you before we turn over to Brian Turner for his question. So Anna, please go ahead.
Thanks, Margie. Yeah, I had a few follow-up questions. I actually had some concern about this idea that stakeholders couldn't request modifications to the load forecast portion of the futures. From my perspective, I'd be interested to know if other stakeholders share this. The drivers of the increase in load, which you see throughout all the futures, not just the mid or the base, but even the low has increased load, are still very opaque. And I've taken a brief look at the materials that were posted to the venue site, and I got a bunch of questions. So I still don't really understand what's going on there. My sense of what will happen as a result of those futures based on modeling we conduct in other jurisdictions is that those load growth assumptions will drive the portfolio results, that they will be probably the key input that results in the portfolio outcomes that you will see across your future and sensitivity combinations. And I think there's a bunch of reasons to consider changing them. One is that we see an increasing norm, if you will, in which you would model a scenario without additional large loads, even if they, are planning to come in service. So they've signed a service contract, they start construction, you might exclude them for purposes of identifying cost causation. So you want to know what resources are added to your system, to serve those loads because they are so significant. The other is that without knowing anything about the terms under which those customers are taking service, there's always a risk of customer defection or loss of customer. And so understanding how that might impact overall cost to customers, I think is also an important thing that IRP modeling can touch on. And then there may also just be changes in the model itself that we'd like to see. So if the line that's being drawn, relates to the econometric portion of the load forecast, that's one thing, because I understand that that's more time intensive and analytically intensive. But if it's related to the load forecast in general, I actually have some deep concerns about whether that is, fixed as you've defined in your stakeholder presentation so far.
Yeah, I think we were trying to point out that there are within those futures the ability to play with some of the components that are included there. That's kind of why I directed Anna Linden to the waterfall file to look at that. We can try to clarify those if they're not clear on what's going on there. But those columns that are used to build up the low and high economic can be modified or changed in various ways. If there's something beyond that, we'd probably try to have you define it more clearly and help define where does the data even come from to run a scenario if we were to do it.
Okay, that's fair. I will take a look at that waterfall chart because I don't recall seeing that one.
Hello, Anna.
Yeah.
This is George. Were you able to get all those files that you were needed? Because you and I had several emails being able to make sure you could both download that. I want to make sure we address that for you. That's very important.
Yeah, thank you, George. I was able to download them this morning.
Okay.
So thanks for
It was a setting that we had on the venue site. I apologize, but thank you for verifying.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, thanks for changing that. The other question I had for you folks relates to Servum. So that there's some risks that, to some degree are common to PNM and other LSCs, but some that I think are also a little bit unique to PNM that are hypothetically more suited to analysis within Servum. One is you folks may follow some of the IRPs in your neighboring jurisdictions, but one of the things that Arizona Public Service is looking at in their resource adequacy modeling is the impact of not holding firm transmission rights on the interstate pipelines that service their gas units. So they historically have almost entirely summer risk on their system, but they do not hold FT rights for any gas service during the winter time for their units. And one of the impacts of changing load profiles because of large loads is that you end up with an elevated level of demand in those seasons that might historically have been considered off seasons or lower periods of demand. I'm curious to know whether you guys are also entertaining the idea of stakeholder requests related to Servum, for something like that, or other risks that might be more, weather-based, which is really the intent of doing the resource adequacy study in Servum.
I don't know that I can answer that. We would probably have to try to run your question past our consultants and see what they felt made sense around that question.
Okay.
So I understand your question, but that's one if you could put in writing and get to it. I think it would be useful.
Sure. Yep. We can definitely do that.
Great.
One other thing that I will put in writing, but I just wanted to flag, for everyone's sort of knowledge here, is that there is you can sometimes get some pretty significant extreme weather effects associated with large loads in CERVM, depending on how they're represented. So that part of the CERVM methodology is you take the last 5 years worth of weather and you use that to create weather adjusted response from demand, because the whole idea is that you are varying renewable production, forced outage rates, load, largely based around weather. And normally what happens is that the entire system is assumed to have the same response to that weather risk. So if you have an extreme cold event, for example, elevated demand because of heating, increases in heating related consumption that you've experienced in the past 5 years are sort of assumed to happen going forward, irrespective of the profile of your load. But a lot of large loads are actually not temperature sensitive in that same way. So they typically do not have heating needs or significant heating needs, but they have much more significant cooling needs. And so one of the things that we'll put into our questions for you, but I think could have a significant impact on CERVM, depending on how that load is represented, is whether those large loads are also subject to that extreme weather response, because you might actually get far more elevated demand in the wintertime and perhaps understated demand in the shoulder seasons, depending on how that's adjusted. And really the way to correct for it is to make sure that those large loads are represented explicitly in CERVM instead of being baked into the overall load forecast.
And we can talk to Power Gem about that and see and just make sure that we're modeling that correctly. But we'll need to get back to you on that, just to make sure that we're clear that large loads, data center additions, those types of things are being accounted for properly. We think they are, but we'll just double check and we'll need to get back to you on that.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Shane, and thanks, Anna, for your question. I think we've got Brian Turner with your hand up. Brian, would you like to go ahead, please, with your question?
Yeah, thank you. This is sort of a follow-up to a question I asked in a previous workshop and a very Anna Linden's question regarding the scenarios and sensitivities. I previously asked about how demand response, battery use, export, or just load modification scales with the different scenarios. And I wonder if you all have had any further thought about that. And I want to just illustrate a little bit. You've got the high EV and building electrification and your high economic growth. Those resources are imminently controllable now and in the future. And you've got the high solar in your low economic growth. And I do have substantial concern about that, because it's not just a modifier to load, it changes the load shape. I would imagine with a low economic growth and a high solar without battery attachment, you see a significantly pronounced duck curve effect, leading to increases in peak. And yet we're seeing increasing attachment rates of batteries with solar. So having that in that scenario without significant batteries and the battery use here, the direct load control batteries in the DR potential study are pretty darn low, shockingly low. I mean, I think you've got like 20 megawatts in 2045. So there is significant interaction, right, between those scenarios: EV growth, building electrification growth, solar growth, potentially with a battery attachment rate. And I just open-ended question whether you've given any more thought about the interaction of those effects, or when I make a sensitivity request, is it going to be change these assumptions in the scenarios and create a new DR package? Is that my best way to get at that? Does that question make sense? And do you have thoughts on how we can get at those interactive effects?
Some of those questions we haven't resolved and gotten an answer to, but we do remember that you've asked that. I would think about whether there's a stakeholder scenario request that helps address your concern, and are some of them things that if you were looking at how the load forecast components going into the HEG or LEG forecast, would you be able to pick out what it is you're trying to adjust in those?
Yeah.
So that goes back to the waterfall files that I'd mentioned.
Right. So let me try seeing if I could get my understanding right. If I could look at those waterfall charts, take out, for instance, a high solar, move it over to the high economic growth scenario, and increase the battery capacity in the DR as a sensitivity to that scenario, and increase the DR potential for electric vehicles, direct load control of electric vehicles, and the building electrification. That perhaps gets to a high DR potential in a high economic growth environment. Does that make sense to you?
But depending on what they wanted, try it. Yeah, I would go ahead and tee it up, and we will try to address that. I think the first part of your question, the answer is yes. If the high solar can be adjusted in those scenarios. But the question on the DR, I don't know whether that's something that can be accommodated. So if you could tee that up, we could try to run it by our consultant.
Okay, thank you.
PNM team, I wonder if it would be helpful to pull back up. I think it's slide 11 that has some of the variables that you're looking for input. And we've had several questions now of what levers are available for stakeholders.
He's going there now.
Okay.
Great.
And I think there's a question about how load forecasting might be modified in some of the stakeholder requests, and now DER. So just to kind of pull, so there's some guidance here of some of the different levers that are being discussed. And then Margie, we do have several questions in the chat that we need to make sure we have time for.
Great, thanks.
There, thank you. While you're there, an early question was on the weighted average cost of capital, and what is PNM's assumption for that?
Anybody know?
Yeah, so that information is also posted on Venue. It's in the modeling financial assumptions document. We're using the last approved weighted average cost of capital from our last approved rate case, and I believe it's 6.9%.
Thank you. Margie, I have a couple more in the chat, or
Yeah,
do you
please
want to go
continue.
to hands?
Yeah, please continue. And then we
Sure.
got Ben Elsie's got his hand up. Let's go to Ben and then go Kathy back to you for the other continue on the chat, please. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, and Margie, I'm not trying to stop the conversation here at all. I was just flagging that the discussion we're having now is exactly the discussion we want to be having after the break. So just flagging that now.
Great. No, I think it's all gonna work out. Thank you, Ben, for the reminder. Appreciate that. Kathy, you want to go back to the chat questions that we have?
Sure. Yep. Drawing back from workshop number 2 in our all-day meeting, did PNM state verbally that 85% of the load growth through 2030 was due to data center loads?
I don't know that I have looked at it from that perspective, but those graphs out on Venue should probably give you a pretty good indication, because it specifically breaks out the economic development load there, and then gives you the total
Okay. Okay. Say the name of the file that they should go back to.
Let me- I would look at that file that's called Load Forecast Federal 11th Workshop Request Workbook.
Okay. Thank you. Also a question about when our stakeholder modeling requests due. And we recognize that since base case results weren't available today, it is very hard for you all to make your requests. So we don't have a date for you. We recognize you need to see those base case results. So we're going to have to just as the information comes in and recognize that you all will need time to respond. So when we can get base case results out and presented and have a chance for a little bit of digestion, and then we will set a date for stakeholder requests. Then moving on, so import tariffs and foreign entities of concern. The tariff uncertainty, along with the fuel cost uncertainty, may be another potential benefit of mechanical long duration storage and other storage or generation resources that can be largely supplied within the US. Will PNM establish a risk or uncertainty factor, like a penalty in the modeling, for resources that have or may become impacted by import tariffs?
We could potentially consider in a stakeholder scenario. We aren't really doing a risk analysis around that. Some of those risks are considered in the cost of just the base cost that we come up with for the different technologies. But if people are trying to vary those, the capital costs and the modeling costs of resources is one of the attributes that people can suggest changes to. We wouldn't really know what to do with that, so you would have to be specific as to what you were trying to accomplish.
Good. Okay. Thank you. I would encourage folks to, as long as we have the time here, let's do this verbally rather than me reading chat and paraphrasing your questions. So a couple more that have just come in. And again, I would really encourage you to ask your questions directly. Anna, I'm responding that April 15th is not the date that requests are due. That is correct. We recognize you need to see the base case results. And so we're going to have to set a date in the future.
But let me add to that response, Kathy. Part of our conversation today and after break is to understand what is at the heart of people's interests. So possibly people with common interests, we can have a collaborative discussion about parameters for modeling runs that serve more than one person's interests. So please stay tuned for that conversation later today, and there'll be more definition of the formal date for modeling run requests after you've seen base case results. Thanks. Additional hands, as Kathy also suggests.
We've got one more in the chat. Why don't I do that while folks are thinking through their questions? But this is following up on the foreign entities of concern and utility scale storage. Is PNM assuming that storage projects in your service territory will be foreign entity of concern compliant and therefore eligible for federal tax breaks?
We are assuming whatever the current law indicates is available, I believe. And on storage, we include an investment tax credit that gets phased out after 2033.
Sam, does that answer your question? Great. Okay.
So thank you.
It does. Yes. Thank you.
Great. Other questions, please raise your hands. We do have time for a few more. Okay. Tom, please go ahead. Tom Solomon.
Thank you. My question is related to PNM's website, where on multiple prominent pages is the commitment for PNM to reach 100% carbon free by 2040. However, the current IRP process that we are in the middle of shows pretty specifically carbon intensity still being high through 2045, which is inconsistent with reaching 100% carbon free by 2040. So I guess I am wondering, what is the level of PNM's commitment to what is publicly stated on the website versus what is being modeled in this current IRP? I note, for example, the text on your website that says we are on track to achieve 75% carbon free in 2026, and we plan to make that 100% carbon free energy by 2040. The IRP literally is the plan. So it doesn't seem like the plan that we are constructing today is consistent with what's on the PNM website. So my question is, what is PNM's commitment to the 2040 date for carbon free?
So Tom, this is Lori, and that question came up in a prior IRP stakeholder. So I'll give you the same answer I gave to Interwest Alliance, which is
Okay.
2040 is still a goal. We are modeling to the law. And if you saw the outcome of our 2024 rate case, we were denied by the commission to expedite the gas depreciation schedules and those, which would mean the early retirement of those. So we are modeling what's been ruled for us thus far. We are still attempting to achieve 2040 if we can, but it's something we're trying to do, but it is also the realities of some of the rulings and other things are going to have impacts on that. We predict over the next 20 years, but it remains a goal. And if you look at our SEC filings, any of our other public filings, you'll see that remaining a goal. I'm actually getting ready to do a presentation, and we hit 80% in 2025 based on our actuals for our system on an energy basis, by the way. So we are very well on our way. Our carbon intensity is planned to be cut by 50% by 2032. So when you say the carbon intensity is high, I'm not quite sure what you're referring to, but our carbon intensity will remain at or below 200 pounds for the duration of the 2030s and into the early 2040s, depending on what happens with resources, with load, with markets, with supply chains, with fuel, with all of the variables that we've discussed today and throughout the last several months. I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't give you an exact promise that on January 1st of 2040, we'll be at 100% carbon free. But I can tell you we are well ahead of any milestone that there is in the state and in the United States today. So very proud of that, and something that I think the state should be very proud of and recognizing as a major accomplishment.
Thank you. Your question is, what am I referring to? I'm referring to slide number 10 on the workshop 3 slide deck from PNM that shows 200 pounds per megawatt hour emissions through the end of 2044 into 2045.
Yep. So that's a 50% reduction over where we are today, and like a 80% reduction over where we were just a few years ago. So I will tell you that a transition of an entire grid that took 100 years to construct and to fund will take the time that it takes to get to 100% carbon free. And we're going to do that in a way that balances affordability, balances reliability, and certainly is cognizant of the environmental impact. So we have a plan that meets all state rules, federal standards, and federal, any of our peers. I will tell you, I can't think of, I'm not aware of a utility that's ahead of us in the US.
That's great. I still claim that the language on the PNM website is inconsistent with your statements today.
So Tom, we
Thank
would
you, Tom.
encourage you, as we get into the second half of this conversation, if there's something that you would like to see differently to have that commitment reflected in a stakeholder modeling run, we would encourage you to put that in and see what that would look like.
Yeah, makes sense.
Thank you.
Great. Ramon, I see you've got your hand up. Ramon, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Margie. I have a feeling this question might be talking about the second half of the conversation, but picking up on a breadcrumb that I feel like you were dropping about stakeholders, sort of understanding thematically aligned interests and maybe working together to develop a scenario. I saw that in the EPE IRP process that I had an opportunity to participate in, but has it been communicated yet how many stakeholder scenarios are going to be able to be supported? And I know that some of them might be easy, some of them harder, but I'm certainly hearing a lot of people with a lot of different scenario sort of ideas of interest, and I guess I'm not anticipating that you all are going to be able to run dozens of stakeholder scenarios, and so just perhaps a little bit of table setting on like what our expectations should be as we're all beginning to imagine putting in stakeholder requests.
Yeah, good question, Ramon. No, there is not a magic number. The process is to really hear from all of you of what is at the heart of your interest and see if perhaps there are parameters that satisfy multiple interests in a single run. We just don't know yet. I wouldn't imagine that collectively we don't have a magic or prescribed number at this point.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Margie, yeah.
Yep.
Just in response to the previous question or dialogue between Brian and Lori Williams, a response here about the company running a no ETA sensitivity and following the law. Thoughts from the PNM team about the inclusion of that no ETA sensitivity?
Sure. I'll share again the same remarks I shared at a prior IRP when the same question was asked. So what we are looking at is data from stakeholders. So we engaged in a number of clean energy task force meetings over the last year and a half. One of the primary requests out of the DOJ was, we see that affordability is going to be very challenged with the compressed investment that gets to the energy transition in the time frame that we have. They are concerned about affordability. I too am concerned about affordability given all of the things that Anna Linden noted going on in the world. We see it in every price that we have, every component we purchase, every piece of land we purchase, every bit of labor that we contract for. Tariffs on top of our materials and equipment are all challenging affordability. And so one of the major questions is, what is the driver? Is this policy driving affordability challenges or not? I will tell you, I suspect that run is not going to produce a whole lot of difference with us being at 80% in actual through 2025. I'm going to guess it has almost no impact, but it's data exclusively. The running runs in the IRP is meant to provide people with information. So that is what we are doing, is providing stakeholders with information. And so doesn't mean we're going to go off and look for changes to the ETA. I don't know why we would do that, given that we are already at 80%. But that is what we're running, is data for purpose of stakeholder involvement and engagement, wondering about questions that they have had. So that is what we are doing, just like we are doing for all of the other stakeholder scenarios that will come in. People looking to see how different variables impact the plans long-term and the magnitude of those impacts. So that is all we are doing. No one is trying to seek a variance from the ETA. You see that, you'll see it in our upcoming resource filing. There's absolutely no request for a variance from the ETA. No effort to try to get the ETA overturned, removed, modified. Nothing of the sort is occurring or planned to occur.
Thank you, Lori. Just a point of clarification. I see a lot in the chat coming in on when will the base case results are expected. And Kelly, I apologize, we don't have a date for you. The PNM team is working over hours over the weekend to try to get the base case reconciled, and we'll have that to you as soon as possible. I know that is frustrating. We all would like to put dates on our calendars. We understand that, and rest assured that once it is out, we will make sure you all know, and we will provide a reasonable window for time for you all to digest before we ask for stakeholder modeling requests. With that, Margie, we have quite a bit on data center loads coming in. I wonder if we want to take just a few minutes here to address that and then go to our break. And Glenn, I see you're asking about a specific scenario. We will come back to that after our break. That is exactly what we have earmarked quite a bit of time for. Kara, I wonder if you might come on and ask a few of your questions.
Sure. I just have some pointed questions on data centers and what data centers may be required to pay for as they request energy service to be delivered to them, meaning what infrastructure costs will be wrapped into those that are the responsibility of the data centers. And then what happens in a scenario where the data centers may not need to take the service anymore? Are those stranded costs that ratepayers on PNM service or PNM system will be required to pick up?
Those are great questions, Kara, and I will respond to those. This is Lori. So we are working through a draft large load tariff that we plan to introduce this year. It is going to affect exactly the things that you talked about to try to protect existing retail customers from the effects of large loads. It's very much in alignment with the national effort that's also taking place. There were announcements out of every major data center company in the last week that they are pledging to cover the costs of their infrastructure additions. We are following along with that and modifying our tariff accordingly. I can't tell you much more because it's still in draft and we're trying to get it finalized. But nationally, that process is taking place, as well as our own NMPRC has announced plans to put together a large load tariff working group. We can't wait for that, so we are trying to put one forward as soon as we possibly can. But really, the spirit and the wording and all of the ideas in it that I've seen and been involved with, I'm not really in the rate group, but I'm aware of the effort going on, is really centered around those protections, both protections for exits, protections for cost shifting, all of those kinds of things.
Thanks, Lori. Can I please add that as she mentioned, tariffs and rate structures are a separate process, not only a working group, but separate proceedings amongst the PRC. So I appreciate the question, Kara. Those conversations will be happening in a different venue, so not a different proceeding. So thanks, Lori, for that. I see Anna, you've got your hand up. I think would like to go ahead and go to the break. Now it's 10:30. Please get a cup of coffee, cup of tea. With the next conversation is intended to be a roundtable discussion that our colleague Ben Elsey will lead for us. It will revolve around stakeholder requested needs. So please grab yourself a beverage and be back in 10 minutes. We'll see you at 10:40 for that conversation. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Ben, can I do a quick audio check with you, please? Can you hear me?
Absolutely, I can hear you loud and clear.
And you're coming in clear as well. Great. Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for the conversation so far. I'd like to introduce our colleague and consultant to PNM and many other utilities across the country, Ben Elsey from E3. Ben has offered to facilitate this next conversation, which is really aimed at getting us closer to defining those modeling runs that are of interest to stakeholders. So hopefully you've got your cup of coffee or tea, and welcome to our roundtable with Ben. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Margie. Yeah, so as Margie just said, my name's Ben Elsey. I'm a senior director here at E3 Consulting. E3 kind of specializes in the clean energy transition. So we help utilities, state agencies, advocates nationwide on kind of the energy transition from both IRPs, RFPs, resource adequacy, reliability, transmission planning type studies. Just a little bit about me personally. So I have been involved in New Mexico IRPs for 11 years now. I filed my first IRP in 2015 and have continued to follow them both for SPS and then also most recently with helping EPE last year. So been in this space for a long time. And the one thing I will probably say here is the IRPs that were filed in 2015 are not the resource portfolio that was eventually built, right? These IRPs rapidly change year upon year. So although this is a 20-year plan, my recommendation to this group is as we focus on this IRP, and I think Tom Solomon kind of hit the nail on the head here, we should be looking at our near medium-term investments and making sure they stand up under long-term scrutiny. So long-term futures impact the investments today, but we're not trying to pick a winner for resources that are going to be built in 2040 or 2045. The other comment that I heard today was from Ramon at Sweep, was really just kind of hinting about the number of stakeholder requests we're likely to get in this process. And although there is not a magic number, as Margie alluded to, realistically speaking, we're not going to be able to run hundreds of different scenarios and sensitivities. So what we're looking at doing in today's conversation and over the next 30, 45 days is really to try and connect stakeholders together and try and see if we can consolidate some of the stakeholder requests to get that to a more manageable number. So hopefully during today's conversation, if we start hearing that Ramon's interested in DER scenarios and Glenn's also interested in something similar, we can try and put those two people together and try and reduce the number of stakeholder requests that we get. And then kind of my other objectives for today is really just to hear from you guys, just to really get this conversation going. And then also see where we can help stakeholders streamline, submit their stakeholder requests to PNM. So just really high level, at E3 here, kind of our general approach for doing IRPs, if we're doing it kind of outside of a stakeholder process, would be first to meet with the executive leadership of the utility. And what we typically do is we have the resource planning department get in front of the executives, produce their list of scenarios and sensitivities, and then it's really open for a brainstorming session where we get to hear from the executive leaders of the utility kind of what scenarios, sensitivities would they like to see? What are the major levers that could be pulled that will fundamentally change the resource portfolio 5, 10, 20 years from now? So in these stakeholder processes, we really want to follow the same kind of trajectory here, where PNM have put forward their potential stakeholder requests. It's a pretty definitive list at this point. Now we want to kind of throw the conversation over to you guys, see if there's any gaps in those stakeholder requests, see if there's anything that you as stakeholders are thinking PNM should be doing differently, and really just have kind of a two-way conversation here. So maybe just to get this conversation started, can people just put in the chat, maybe just type in the word yes if they're planning on submitting a stakeholder request in PNM's IRP? Let's just get a gut feeling for how many stakeholders we're likely to hear from. Okay, we'll give it just another minute here. At the moment, this is a lot less stakeholder requests than I was expecting, so this may make the conversation short. Okay. So we're just seeing a few here coming in. And maybe the next question that I have for you guys, particularly the people who typed in yes into the chat here, is anybody willing to kind of come off mute here and maybe just at very high level, the 30,000-foot view, kind of just describe a type of scenario they would be looking for PNM to run? Okay, seeing no volunteers.
Ben, I can start us off if I might. Just for
Please
Glenn
do.
Wickel, who Glenn Wickel, I think is having microphone troubles, so I'll be his proxy. But he offered in the chat before break modeling geothermal expansion as a generic
That's
resource.
not what I was going to talk about, though.
Oh, okay, Glenn, good. You're on. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, got my mic fixed. No, my overall larger concern is that PNM is holding back on aggregate DR and VPP launch. I would say until their AMI meters are rolled out throughout the system, and as best I can tell, these vendors that provide the devices for these programs all provide internet connectivity and telemetry from their devices. So the AMI shouldn't be required. And then secondarily, PNM wanted to collect baseline data, but there's generic baseline data out there. And I think we saw that in the IRP for EPE, which you actually worked on. So can we accelerate the rollout of those programs and have a scenario to show what that looks like?
Okay. So just to kind of facilitate this discussion, Margie, Kathy, maybe just real quickly, are you able to bring up the slide which shows the scenarios that PNM are currently planning on running?
Margie, I'm going to ask you to do that since I'm doing notes here. That's slide 11 that we had, or maybe Deb?
I will do it. Yeah, I will do it. Give me a minute. And I see that Tom also can articulate his. So let me bring that up.
Thank you.
So Glenn, just as Margie's putting up the slide here, what I'm hearing really as an alternative to potentially kind of peaking resources, potentially a scenario with higher DER, VPP type penetration sooner than PNM are currently planning. Is that a fair statement?
Yep.
Okay. And is the concern the quantity and approach that PNM are currently taking, or is it just the timing that you feel it's going to, it's a fair number, it's just happening too late?
My primary concern was timing, but I think I've heard from other stakeholders that the quantity is an issue as well. We just heard that earlier today. The amount of battery attachment that they're assuming might be lower than we should expect. Check.
I think that comment was made from Brian. Brian, are you still on? Are you able to chime in? Sorry to put you on the spot here.
I am. Yeah, no, I'd love to talk about this. I think that there's a lot more potential out there for what may be called demand response, aggregated demand response, VPP, whatever you wish to call it. It is in batteries. As I understand it, you may be seeing, significant solar growth now. I don't know for sure the figures, but 40 megawatts a year. Does that sound reasonable to PNM behind the meter solar additions? If your attachment rate is currently, between 10 and 20%, that's relatively small additions. But if that battery attachment rate were to increase to 50%, just as a benchmark of what some states that California, for instance, they're achieving 70% attachment rates these days. So there is, both for resiliency purposes, affordability purposes, lots of reasons why that attachment rate might increase. So we could see substantial increases in behind the meter batteries. Vehicles, you've got your EVs and managed charging in your DR potential study. So there's both the adoption of EVs there, but also the potential for vehicle to building, using those vehicles as home load management, and even vehicle to grid certainly in the planning period. And then you've got the building electrification with HVAC and hot water heaters, and I have not dove into your assumptions regarding those adoption rates. But all those categories could be available for aggregated demand response. So would like to see that kind of high demand response / VPP potential reflected, and looking at, as I discussed, the interaction then with the scenarios and the growth rates of both solar and electrification scenarios.
Okay. So first, Margie, you're doing me too much credit here. My eyesight is no longer that good. Do you mind just zooming in slightly there?
Margie, why don't I share? If you want to take it down, I think I can do it.
And then maybe just as that's happening, Brian, Glenn, just to kind of build on this, right? There's typically two ways you can look at increased penetration of DER, VPP, etc. You can either kind of force it into the model where you say, hey, update your load forecast or your assumptions to include these resources, or you can have it as kind of a selectable candidate resource within the model, and the model will select it if it's kind of the optimal from a cost perspective. Kind of what approach are you imagining here for kind of this increased penetration of behind the meter solutions?
Yeah, in general, having it as a selectable resource stacked alongside other resources is a preferable long-term approach. I think we need to get into how the modeling treats it. Would love your feedback on that to see if that's feasible at this stage. I will note things like, I don't understand ICF's work on the potential, because like I said, you've got 20 megawatts of direct load control behind the meter batteries in 2045, and yet the cost of that resource is like $50 a kilowatt year. So substantially below whatever avoided cost your metric is. So I think it would perform very well on a selectable resource. But I just would love your feedback on what the modeling is best able to accomplish.
Yeah, so I know there's usually a preference for selectable resources, so we can run that through with PNM. Sometimes my one concern with doing them as selectable is it becomes very much a binary decision. So it doesn't, it doesn't inform you of kind of the potential cost benefits or cost overruns if it's not selected. So sometimes there is a benefit for kind of just forcing them in, and that way you get to see kind of the cost out between a counterfactual case. So you kind of have a clear indication of how much those resources potentially save. But I know, just from past New Mexico IRPs, there's definitely a preference for them to be selectable. So what maybe my advice would be here, Brian, Glenn, would be maybe if you two could connect with with one another. Maybe we could just do a quick real poll again, just in the chat here. Are there anybody else, any other stakeholders who maybe would be interested in kind of what I'm imagining to be like a residential DER VPP behind the meter type scenario, who could work with Brian and Glenn on pulling together a scenario request? If you could just type yes in the chat. So we got Brad here. And then Ramon. Perfect.
And Ben, can you advise a little bit more about how the model would construct this? I mean, is there a supply curve of resources, or do we have a whole pool available at a set price? How do you all work it on the modeling end?
Yes, so I haven't set up the model. I'll maybe just pass that over to PNM if they're able to answer. If not, we can get back to you. Guys at PNM, do you currently have behind the meter or alternatives to supply side generation set up within Encompass, and how's that captured? Okay, I'm not
Room
hearing
is muted.
Kathy, can
We're
we,
not hearing the
without hearing
conference
from
room.
PNM,
That's
can we maybe
you're-
just take
you're
that as an
not-
action item?
Sorry,
There, I
sorry
think
about
they're on.
that. Can you guys hear us now?
Yes.
Go ahead,
Yes, we
Glenn.
can.
Sorry, we were on mute for some reason. Let me address that if I can, Ben. So in the modeling right now, we have we talked a lot about the demand response resources, candidate resources that would be available to compete against every other technology as well. Those are all part of this this huge list of types of resources and amounts that can be added in the capacity expansion planning. So we have that set up already. And to your point, Ben, right now they're set up to just be selected as needed or as they are economic to meet the needs of the system going out for the next 20 years. So if the results do show, let's just say for the current trends and policies, that one or more or all of those demand side resources are needed in certain years or all in the same year, those will be determined by the software, and then we will evaluate those results, and that's what we plan to present, next go around. But they are certainly available as candidate resources. In addition, we can also force those in if necessary in a certain year to see what those impacts are compared to a different case, so we can see what the economics would be.
So I just want to
Thanks.
ask for clarification. So these are all fixed numbers on each one of these selectable resources. And I thought Brian was asking if there's any way for the model to evaluate sort of a continuous spectrum, a curve, if you will, and select a point off of a curve. Is that something Encompass can do?
So the costs and the potential that we are utilizing is based on what the potential study showed for these demand side resources. Now, if you want to change the cost parameters or the sizing of or the potential of the demand response programs, those would be inputs that we could change as well. But it to your question, Glenn, it doesn't tell me at what cost it would be economic. We need to put that in as an input. Now we could do analysis to try to determine at what cost level they would be economic, but that goes quite a bit further into what we would call a stakeholder scenario.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't really thinking of cost. I was thinking of the capacity, like at a number of capacity points, like we just talked about what 25 megawatts or something. Could we have a spectrum from 25 to 50 megawatts that it could pick any value along there and it would know what the cost would be? Or does it have to just have very specific points like 25, 30, 50 or whatever?
We could set that up to select whatever size you would like, or we could set it to unlimited and just add as much as it wanted to add at any point in time at a given cost.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for that. And is there a data source, a data sheet that you can point us to that would give an indication of what that current potential at a given price point is? I'm familiar with the potential study, and I don't think it includes what I'm describing as a supply curve, basically what's the potential at a given price point, because I think that's what we're talking about, or what you were referring to modifying at that in your last comment.
Yeah, so Tom talked about that earlier. We said that we have posted on the venue site all
Mm-hmm.
the modeling inputs, costs,
Mm-hmm.
assumptions, characteristics for all the DR potential programs
Okay,
out on
great.
venue. So you can, I would point you to that,
Mm-hmm.
download that, take a look at that. And that should give you a really good sense of, what the potential is for all these different DR programs and what the costs we're assuming. These are all based on the potential study.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I appreciate the expressions of other folks that want to work on this. So we will coordinate. I have to drop
Yeah,
off.
so
Okay, Ben, I'll turn it back to you.
yeah, perfect. Yeah, so maybe just as Brian's dropping off here, maybe it's a great next step here would be the people who've expressed interest on a DER VPP type solution. If you guys could connect independently, review the information that's been posted to the SharePoint site, work together to come up with a scenario, and then obviously come prepared for the April meeting with some potential inputs and assumptions. I think that would be a fantastic next step. So it sounds like maybe on the residential side, we've got a potential scenario here. Is there anyone else willing to come off mute now and maybe describe their scenario? Kathy, if we had anyone in the chat.
We do. Yep. Tom Solomon and Darren Zygich. So Tom, why don't we start with you, and then Darren will go on to you once we kind of work through Tom's thinking here.
Thanks, Kathy. So I think my scenario is going to be a little more qualitative, but I'll just tell you my thinking. I think my primary interest is to ensure that the state of New Mexico achieves the goals, the RPS standards set out in the Energy Transition Act by 2045 or sooner, and that we minimize the amount of carbon pollution that we put into the atmosphere that's driving planetary warming. And I think it's also important to understand that a lot of the customer impacts that will come along during this IRP timeframe are not going to be possible to model because, wildfires and increased levels of drought and heat stroke risk and all of those things, extreme weather. I don't know how you put those into a modeling scenario, but they sure are important. My high level vision is that, by 2045, we are 100% carbon free. And if by 2040, PNM can achieve that same goal, all the better per their public commitments. I think at that point in time, we are probably, 10 to 20% clean firm as the resource, and the rest of it is some mix of wind and solar with a lot of battery backup and geothermal. I think geothermal is probably going to be the primary clean, firm resource in that time frame. And the question is, when do you build all of that out? I absolutely support the previous discussion about looking at increased levels of DERs and virtual power plants and batteries throughout the grid, including electric vehicle batteries. The question is, how do we get there at the least cost? I don't think we should be considering nuclear small modular reactors. I think if we were to do that in a portfolio and propose it in real life, there would be just an enormous upwelling of opposition from citizens of the state of New Mexico who have deep levels of concern and history with the impacts of uranium mining, and whether it's fair to burden small modular reactors with all of that or not. I think that reaction is going to be real. So I wouldn't include those. I think geothermal is probably the best option for clean firm, and by the time frame we're talking about, it will be real. I fully confident that we will be building significant amount of geothermal on the grid, hopefully in New Mexico in the 2030s. It will become real and cost effective enough to include. So that is kind of my high level articulation of the scenario that I'd like to see spun. 80 to 90% renewable resources, solar and wind, with a lot of battery backup, probably a lot more battery than we are currently planning on for the previous discussion. And, maybe some nuclear imported from Palo Verde and Arizona, which is the current scenario, and the rest of the clean firm resource likely relies on geothermal.
So Tom, let me pull on that thread a little bit.
Yep.
Margie, can we go to the slide where PNM are presenting the scenarios they're running? There's a couple here, Tom, which I'm going to ask if they kind of address your concern. The first, somewhere on here, is a social cost of carbon, or a carbon tax, which is, a crude way, granted, of capturing those social cost of carbon impacts that you describe.
Yes.
The other scenario that PNM, are planning on running here is a no gas scenario. And in the no gas scenario, almost certainly the outcome is going to be a huge amount of wind, solar, lithium ion storage until you start seeing potential kind of emergent techs in the out years. I'm just wondering if those two scenarios in themselves essentially accomplish what you were trying to achieve, or if there's something quantitatively different that you would like to see here.
I think that goes a long way towards doing that. I would not rely on any current estimate of carbon tax scenario from the federal government today. Maybe what we had a few years ago would be more reasonable. But we need to look at what that carbon tax is and whether it's high enough. No new natural gas resources is absolutely consistent with what I'm talking about. I think the scenario we talked about in the previous geothermal workshop, where we take down the CapEx cost for building classic hydrothermal and new EGS geothermal, is probably consistent with that, with what I'm talking about. I don't see that as an option here. So we probably want to find a way to put that in there. We probably need more transmission than we've got. I don't know if the current transmission boxes that you've got on there are sufficient. And is the increase in grid battery adoption a selected sensitivity? I'm having trouble reading the whole slide.
Say that one more time for me, please. Sorry, Tom.
Increasing VPP's, battery penetration. How do you select for that?
Yeah, I think what Shane was just describing is, it's a selectable resource as it stands today. And then, Glenn and Brian are potentially going to go away and look at a more aggressive option for kind of those behind the meter solutions. So I think that's kind of the current approach.
Okay. Anyway, that's my input. Thanks.
So just maybe just to pull on well, actually, Kathy, were there any other comments in the chat right now?
Yeah, that was going to be where I was headed. If anyone else wanted to weigh in on what Tom just articulated as a vision, nothing in the chat.
Okay. Hearing none, maybe I'll just kind of pull on a thread again that Tom was just alluding to, which is transmission build out. So at the moment, PNM are proposing 4 different transmission scenarios. I know we've had Interwest on the phone in the past, maybe Patton on the phone in the past. Just kind of gut feeding, general indication on the 4 scenarios that are being planned. Anything you would like to see different here? If I could maybe call on some of the transmission folks.
I don't see Remy on today, but Interwest, if you have, I think Brian Turner had to drop, but.
And Grid United, I think we had someone from Grid United here earlier, Clara.
I know there was quite a bit of interest in Southline as well, and interconnections there.
I could, I got to add a quick one. I have heard Zanskar say personally to me that they are limited at their current location at Lightning Dock by the capacity of the, not transmission, but small distribution spur that services their Lightning Dock facility. So they have identified a significant amount of additional geothermal generation capacity with that hydrothermal resource if they had more transmission at that location. But they can't they can't get it to the grid because of that distribution line is maxed out. So that would be one to very specifically add to the grid, which then opens up the more general question of if and when we locate the best places in New Mexico to build more geothermal generation, putting in the transmission connections to get them connected, which is, I think, probably outside the scope of these transmission projects here because they are very specific routes.
Yeah,
Thank you,
my
Tom.
kind of feedback. Oh, sorry, Kathy.
Go ahead,
My
Ben.
feedback there, Tom, is my recommendation would be probably not be too specific on individual resources. You kind of end up going down a lot of rabbit holes here.
Sure.
I think the broader question is just in terms of resource availability in certain areas on the transmission system, and then potentially kind of interconnection costs and timings that's associated with candidate resources, and kind of make it a more of a broader question than like very specific to one existing, location. But definitely hear your concern and definitely can look into that a little bit further.
Okay, I'll add one more since you
So-
got me going.
Before you do, Tom, let me just
Sure.
break in and say that also Anna Linden and Jacob have transmission interests. Maybe we should go to them to hear theirs first.
Sure.
I'd like Jacob to detail this. Jacob is the transmission specialist on our team.
Okay, Jacob, please.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. WRA is certainly interested in modeling the South line. And in addition, I've been working with Remy at Interwest on trying to put together a scenario where multiple of these transmission projects would be included in a sensitivity to kind of give maybe a more regional markets approach to see, how much trading could be done. But hearing and learning more about how PNM's system is roughly only 50% used for their own customers, I think will play a role in that. And I unfortunately have just gotten back to work and haven't had a chance to go through all of the work files, the modeling assumptions. So I'm sure my requests will change as I have an opportunity later this week to dig into that. So I appreciate you all taking the time.
Thanks, Jacob. Do you think it's fair to put Remy down as somebody who would be interested in a smaller conversation on transmission scenarios? Yeah.
Certainly.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so great conversation so far. What I'm hearing, definitely a consolidated scenario for some sort of residential DER type program. Some interest in potentially exploring additional transmission connectivity. And then Tom, kind of to your point, just how you reach New Mexico's ETA goal kind of affordably, reliably, making sure you factor in all true costs. Are there any other kind of high level subjects? I've saw a lot of chat in the last couple of workshops on large loads. How are people thinking about the load forecast? Yeah, sorry, Kathy, jump in.
Ben, we also have Darren Zygich has the high level concept that Darren, could you articulate what you have in mind? Thanks, Darren.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Question, the big elephant in the room in a lot of cases is large load customers and how they're going to impact the cost of service to smaller customers. And I understand the concerns and I appreciate the concerns. But, on the flip side of that, it'd be nice to understand what are the potential benefits of bringing in a large load customer that wants to provide 24/7 clean energy tariff capability to itself. Like the announcement of Google up in Minnesota with a 100-hour iron air battery with Xcel Energy. Those are the types of resources that are going to be necessary to get us over the finish line. And we brought this up in a resource case for our current data center in Los Lunas, that it'd be nice if PNM could team up with some of these large load customers to provide long duration storage, which, a lot of it is technically available. Pumped hydro has been technically available for 100 years. It's just a matter of having the capital to go and do it. And so this late long duration storage maturity is kind of a misnomer because there's plenty of long duration energy storage capabilities out there. And the nice thing is that they're locally sourced and built and avoids tariffs and has a much higher ELCC than this pasting together batteries to get us over the finish line. That'll bury us all. So I'm just trying to, can we come up with a scenario where we have a large load customer that ponies up for half of a long duration storage facility and the rest of it goes to the rest of the customer base, I guess, or something to that nature. Kind of what is currently happening with the current data center, but kind of to another level, I guess.
Okay. So maybe just to repeat that back real quick, Darren, really what we're hearing here is the potential for unemergent technology, in this case specifically long duration energy storage, to be potentially subsidized by a large load customer. So the costs that are modeled may not be reflected of the entire cost of the equipment, of the CapEx expenditure. It may be something less, 50%. So I think that would be a scenario they could certainly look at. The one piece of feedback though I have on a statement that you made earlier, and I've seen some chatter, is on this kind of concept of cost allocation, cost causation. I'm certainly not saying that that can't be kind of implied by an IRP, but when you're modeling generically priced resources, I do get really nervous because the last thing that I would want anyone to do is to make a decision from generically cost assumptions that PNM should or should not pursue data center load. I think that comes from a subsequent kind of regulatory proceeding. So just throwing that out there. But going back, Darren, to your point, I absolutely think we could look at doing a technology in which you have subsidized costs, essentially. Is there anything else you would like to see in that scenario, or is it just really a lower cost LDES?
Yeah, no, I think that's the crux of it. That was kind of our request, was that if we are going to bring in large load customers, you certainly can't serve them with 4-hour batteries. And so something else needs to be done. And if they can provide the initial capital, does it pencil out, I guess, if we get some large influx to really push these things forward? Because they're not coming in on RFPs that have a 2-year look ahead, because everybody knows you can't build that in 2 years. So it's got to be something that's planned and capital expended upfront. And that's where I think we've hit the roadblock on what our utilities are willing and able to do in that space, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I would just say, when you talk about, the cost effectiveness of continuing to add 4-hour lithium ion storage, that typically does get captured in capacity expansion modeling. If you're modeling ELCCs, you're going to see the declining capacity value, and obviously that requires more and more resources. So if you make long duration energy storage available, maybe it's not cost effective today just because of the cost versus accredited capacity, but over time it should naturally come into the fold.
Okay, thank you.
We have a couple of hands up that have been very patient. So thank you. I want to return just in case on the transmission. I'm not sure we heard from everybody. So Anna and Ramon, do you have a transmission related?
No, mine would be a change of topic.
Okay, Anna?
No, huh?
Okay, so maybe before we move from transmission, anybody else? I'm capturing some of the key ideas and folks who might be interested. And I've seen several in the chat. I've got those down, but is there anyone else that wants to weigh in on transmission before we move on? Okay. Okay, I also recognize geothermal. There's quite a bit on that. Tom, I see yours. Glenn, I know you had some on geothermal, but let's go to Anna since she's been quite patient, and then Ramon, and we'll return to geothermal after that.
Kathy, let me ask that if there's anybody else that's interested in what Darren just offered on the large load subsidization of emerging technology, is anybody else interested in that we need to include in that conversation? Patrick? So
Kara, thank you. Yes, Kara.
Kara, and I can't tell from the chat what people are responding to right now. So
WRA is interested in Darren's scenario, though we might approach it differently, and we would like to discuss that at a future time.
Great.
I think the concept's really interesting. It's not necessarily the way that I conceptualize modeling it, but would like to talk about that.
Okay, so I see Brian Andrews, Kathy, maybe you've seen Brian Andrews, Anna Linden, Kara, Darren, Patrick. Are you responding to the large load provision of, yes, to large load? Pat, thank you.
Margie, I would just say, just to Anna's point, just to try and help facilitate this conversation, that really the mechanism and how you introduce large or long duration energy storage maybe isn't the key concept from an IRP, right? Really what we're trying to see is, how does an LDS resource on the system impact the capacity expansion plan? So what you could potentially just do is, force in a long duration energy storage resource, see how it impacts the system, and if you think it provides benefits. And the actual mechanism for bringing that online, whether it's a subsidization, whether it's another approach, really is for kind of like a future proceeding. So I wouldn't get too hung up on exactly the mechanism of how to do it.
Okay. Thanks, Kathy. Now back, and Ben, is there anything else direction you want to head before Kathy calls some of the other people with their hand up?
No, this is great conversation. Let's keep going.
Okay, Kathy, please.
Good. Yep. Anna, on to you, and then Ramon will go to you next.
Thanks, Kathy. I have a few thoughts. One is, based on some work that we've done elsewhere, I think some of these potential recommendations might benefit from iteration after the fact of going through the SERVM, portfolio verification. And so I just wanted to flag that as something that I think would be helpful to bake into the timeline, because there is a bit of a risk doing stakeholder scenarios like this, where you just sort of throw something over the fence and you say, it is what it is, whether it's sort of complete or not, or meets the objective that the stakeholder is raising or not. So I just wanted to flag that first of all. And then the other thing I wanted to raise is that there's when you have additional load in your load forecast, particularly load that is that has a high utilization factor and is significant in size, those qualities tend to sort of override any other changes that you might make to your resources or your portfolio assumptions. And so I think it would be worth thinking about combining a bunch of these things together. So like one scenario that I imagine could be potentially useful is a scenario that does not allow the model to rely on hydrogen or carbon capture and sequestration to comply with the ETA, includes the changes to the geothermal costs that Tom was talking about, includes, the additional VPP resources that I think that Brian was talking about, and perhaps make some other changes too, so that you have the possibility of the model doing something different just because you have a large enough resource to actually influence the model result. And so there might be some considerations around like whether some of these resources should really be standalone or they should be part of other, scenario assumptions so that they actually get selected by the model.
Yes. Oh, sorry, Anna.
I was just going to switch to a third topic, Ben, unless you want to say something about that.
Yeah, if you don't mind just me quickly responding to your comments, because I think they're very fair observations here. Maybe just go into your first part, is I think the way that PNM is structured, the stakeholder requests, you kind of can achieve somewhat of what you asked, right? You can go through and say, hey, I want to see the scenario in which there's no new natural gas, which essentially avoids carbon capture, it avoids hydrogen conversion, etc. And then you can go in and kind of check the other kind of bundles that you would like to see. But in terms of combining scenarios together, I think is a kind of a real valid remark. And ideally, what I would like to see, and this is kind of maybe me living in my dream world, is a handful of really strong scenarios at the beginning, and then potentially a second round where you go and combine some of the scenarios together and see if there's any like synergistic benefits between those kind of solutions. And we saw that with EPE's IRP, is if you kind of added on demand response to DERs, the sum of the parts was kind of less than the total savings, right?
Mm-hmm.
So ideally, you would give yourself enough time to do that modeling. But I think that's why it's really important that we try and like get down to some really strong core scenarios on this first go around, so we're not just like completely overwhelmed by the number of scenarios to run. So just wanted to say that I think it's a great observation, and hopefully that's something we'll have time to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. That would be my perspective too, Ben. Similarly, I think there's some issues that, at least for me, are like very much outstanding in the sense that I don't have a good sense of how PNM is going to address them. One is I don't really know what metric we are using to judge what ultimately becomes the preferred portfolio. And in scenarios where you have different scenario drivers that highly influence what the cost, for example, of the portfolio looks like, you can, I think, run into some challenges in comparing portfolios just on the basis of cost. So for example, if you are comparing scenarios with and without ETA compliance, I don't know if that is saying something about what the preferred portfolio might look like, or if we are sort of evaluating those individually of each other and just looking for commonalities across the portfolio. I also don't have a good sense of how the gas price volatility study that's been conducted by Siemens will be used, because it seems like that's different than the commodity price forecasts that were alluded to earlier in the call. And then oh my goodness, it's escaping me now. I can't remember what it is. There was a third point that I was going to raise, but I guess the overall question I have is sort of what is how are we judging these portfolios against each other? Because we could do kind of endless portfolios that have more expense, but if there are other, metrics that we're using to decide sort of what the preferred portfolio is, that would be really helpful to understand.
Okay. Kathy, can we take that as just as an action item? So I heard two there. One was how the gas price volatility study would be incorporated. And then the other really is, and just to summarize and paraphrase here, least cost doesn't necessarily mean most cost effective or optimal portfolio, right? It's how do we build out that framework to evaluate the kind of the more qualitative distinctions, risk distinctions between different portfolios.
Yeah, and I don't think they have to be qualitative. I mean, they could just be, they could be different quantitative metrics. So for example, you'll get the same dynamic if you have lots of large load on your system. You'll naturally have a higher PPRR, right? And so if you're judging portfolios exclusively on the basis of cost, then that would suggest that you don't want to add large loads because you will incur more cost. And there needs to be some way to think about that, which I think is one of the reasons that we actually can't really separate cost allocation from IRP modeling. We want to have some information about how those costs will be allocated to customers in order to figure out how these different portfolios will impact customers, because that's ultimately the perspective from which we're creating the IRP, right? It's supposed to be, even though it's PNM conducted, it's supposed to be on behalf of customers. So I think having some sense of what those metrics are would be super helpful. And I think there's some even reliability metrics that we haven't talked about at all, as far as I know, that would be particularly important to understand. Like one of the implications of large loads is that there will be significantly more demands around stability analyses on the transmission planning group, and having a sense of what those analyses are, what the short circuit ratio is of the system, how the feasibility studies are being conducted, I think would also help inform how we might judge, the relative merits of the portfolios.
Okay. And Anna, everything you've said today makes complete enough sense to me. I understand exactly where you're going here. Just a high level question here, outside of kind of really diving in and making sure, the analysis is done correctly. Have you got kind of any thoughts in your mind of additional scenario sensitivities that maybe you would like to see, or are you kind of not at that point?
Yeah, so the first one I would flag is that sort of ETA compliance, but without hydrogen and CCS. I do think that there's a reason to do multiple different scenarios around large loads, but I feel sort of unequipped to say what those might be with any specificity, because I feel like I need more information about PNM's load forecast. And then I do think there's some potential scenarios to do in CERVM, again, depending on how those large loads are incorporated, what your study year or years are in CERVM, and also what the FT rates, arrangement is for PNM's existing gas units and what it would look like for future gas units. So I have some I guess broad sketches of scenarios, but need to delve more into the information that's recently posted on Venue, and then perhaps get some additional information to add more specifics to those recommendations.
I'm just going to ask you one follow-up, because I think it potentially impacts the critical path in the filing of the IRP. When you talk about doing some additional CERVM analysis, are you talking about potentially changing the inputs and assumptions going into CERVM, for example, like correlated winter outages, I think you were alluding to earlier? Or are you talking about running the actual capacity expansion plan that's selected and encompassed back through CERVM on the back end?
I'm talking about that portfolio verification step that would include some of those changes. So There's a few ways I can think about this. One is if you look at PNM's load forecast, even in the current trends and policy scenario, you have a fairly significant jump up in demand that I think is mostly related to EV charging, but I'm not totally clear if that's the case. And we're talking about a modeling exercise that is mostly going to be focused on resources that are added after 2032. And it would be super helpful to get an understanding of what the existing RA position is of the utility once those loads are added in the late 2020s. Because I think that would help identify whether some of those resource adequacy risks that might come out in your simulations related to the Encompass portfolios are partially driven by what is happening in the next 5 years as opposed to what is happening, in the post 2032 timeframe. And then oftentimes lack of fuel availability is treated as a forced outage factor. It's a gas cause code, which is part of what influences the forced outage rates that are modeled in CERBAM. But there may be like a scenario to model around what happens if you just don't have gas availability during certain periods of the wintertime. Some sort of like bookend scenario that you might want to represent that would implicate changes to your CERBAM inputs for that study year that PNM was already intending to model.
Okay. Okay, makes sense to me. Yep, I get where you're coming from. Kathy, Margie, anyone else in the chat here?
Yeah, I see Ramon's got his hand up, and then I'd like to also ask Kelly Gould if she's on. She put a maybe in her response but let's start with Ramon and then say, Kelly, if you've got some ideas that you're kicking around, it'd be great to know what they are. Ramon, please go ahead.
Great, thank you. I guess a couple of things on my mind. I know that in maybe some of those selectable boxes, there was something around time of use. And I recall from the El Paso Electric experience that one of the scenarios that was run was essentially an opt-out time of use sort of assumption, where most people were on a time of use and there was maybe like a 15% of people opted out. And I guess, that is one of the scenarios, Ben, I believe, where we saw some real interesting synergies, especially when we combined it with like the residential DER scenario. So I think I would be interested in seeing that again, and would be happy to meet with others if there's a desire to sort of determine like what that should look like. But in addition to the TOU forecast specifically, I might suggest that like a managed charging could also be sort of like bolted onto that, because I know we saw that there was a significant impact of EV load on coincident peak in the El Paso Electric, and looking at some of the assumptions there, it seemed like a high proportion of those vehicles were not necessarily on a managed charging program. And so maybe having sort of this high penetration of, the light duty EVs, being on a managed charging program and adhering to those managed charging parameters so that it doesn't have as big of an impact. I'd kind of like to see some of these like rate and policy impacts and the impact that they would have. And then I was going to echo the desire to have the opportunity to potentially take some of these scenarios and blend them because of those synergistic effects that both you and Anna have talked about.
Yeah, and that makes total sense, Ramon. Yeah, I think with that one, potentially the conversation or the group that was tending to form around DERs, I don't know if it requires a separate group or if maybe that group could just become a little bit more about kind of demand side alternative solutions, which includes
Sure.
DERs, rate-based solutions, might be a good fit there.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I know we raised our hand to participate in that group. So if we came back with maybe 2 scenarios that could even be blended. And then the other comment that I had, I believe the way you framed it was like a residential DER. And I think it would also be reasonable to have like a commercial industrial sort of either DR or VPP scenario, trying to figure out how to get some of those other customers also participating in demand response, whether it's a forced amount or selectable.
I intentionally led you there with residential, Ramon. I was hoping you were going to jump in and ask about C&I. So I think that kind of makes sense. So maybe kind of just repeating back here, centering on maybe a residential DER type solution, potentially with a rate-based component for TOU, and then maybe a C&I more targeted towards DR scenario as well.
Yeah.
And then we can, if we have the time and we can get kind of, like I said, a consolidated core amount of scenarios, we can look at kind of stacking these on top of one another if time permits.
Yeah, that'd be excellent. I know in the El Paso Electric, you were able to combine a couple, and we never quite got to being able to like stack multiple. We never had the TOU and the Res DER and the C&I DR. Like that would have been really interesting. So having gone through a process now once, if we could figure out how to get to having those discrete scenarios that can be then combined and have synergies explored, that'd be really exciting, I think.
All right, Margie, Kathy, any other questions here? And how are we doing for time? Sorry.
Yeah, we're at 11:40. Margie, I'm going to let you determine how much longer we can go. We've got a couple different hands. I know geothermal, we have yet to really address. Lots in the chat on that.
So I think it'd be useful, Kathy, for you to share the synopsis of what we have in terms of ideas and names of people, and to the question in the chat about how we connect small groups. I think I would suggest that we take this summary and send a note out to groups of people that saying you all had an interest in this, and so we can connect the smaller group by email. We've been asked for privacy reasons not to share the whole stakeholder list with everybody, so we can do it as a targeted follow-up. But Kathy, might you and Ben share what we have so far in our summary to see if we've missed any people who want to engage on those topics?
Yes, let me pull up. So I have been taking notes to try to encapsulate what we heard, and pretty straightforward here, but several different runs or interests. The residential DER, we heard higher attachment rates for batteries, sooner penetration for DER, both on the timing and higher quantities, EV adoption rates, and some sort of managed charging program, all of that in the bailiwick of some sort of a RESI scenario. Within that, also a supply curve, maybe a range of capacity amounts rather than a discrete number, with a TOU potential component there. And then a second consideration under C&I and a DER target. And so these folks are who we've captured thus far. If I don't have everybody, please drop your name in the chat with DER attached to it, and I will add you. Second scenario we heard was the Energy Transition Act achievement by 2045. Tom Solomon, we heard you started this off for us. Thank you, of some of the different requirements, different resource mix. Ben, I think you had suggested maybe the new natural gas and carbon tax as the proxy there as a starting point, and then some modifications within that on hydrogen consideration and carbon capture. Geothermal, I've just pulled this a little bit from the chat. I know there's quite a bit more discussion on this. We've heard interest in modeling and expansion as a generic resource, and then reducing the CapEx cost both on the hydrothermal and geothermal side, and potentially the long duration storage as a pumped local resource. Then transmission connectivity, what PNM is doing in their modeling, they have the 4-line scenarios. We've heard folks mention the lightning dock, a line upgrade to increase capacity there, or a south line expansion, or a regional transmission scenario, maybe multiple lines. And then these folks that I have captured in as interest. Again, if you're not on here and you would like to be, please drop it in the chat with the scenario that you were particularly interested in. Large loads, this one is a little bit of a hybrid here. We had some large load, but also interest in long duration storage specifically. So kind of started with a large load customer that might subsidize long duration storage, but I think it kind of ended on long duration storage, the resource impact to the capacity expansion. Couple action items that I've captured here from Anna's questions, and then I had a last one on gas availability and resource adequacy for gas.
Kathy, let's add the action item. Oh, you got it. Criteria to evaluate portfolios. Great. The metrics. Yeah, metrics and criteria. Perfect. Okay. Ben, what else would you like to do in the next 5 minutes with this topic before we close for today?
Yeah, I think probably just with the time we've got, we probably don't have the time to jump into another subject in detail. Maybe I'll just kind of outline my desires and hopes from today's conversation is, I'm by certainly not saying, we need to get out of the detail, but from my perspective, if we could kind of focus on these high level topics over the next 30 days and just make sure everyone's getting heard in kind of these potential scenarios that really can move the needle, that would be fantastic. Obviously, we can still, respond to detailed data requests, but I would kind of like to take this up, maybe a notch and keep this a little bit high level. Other than that, I think what we've heard today really aligns with what we've seen in other IRPs recently. And I think we've covered the main core subjects. So I don't think we're missing anything. It just strongly encourage stakeholders to talk with one another, reach out, work together, and hopefully come up with like a really core, strong set of scenarios that we can then delve into and build upon.
Thanks, Ben. And I'm also I see a lot coming into the chat. I will digest that here as we conclude. But Anna Linden, your request that the entire stakeholder list be notified, we can put into the meeting summary from today the scenarios that are being suggested and who has indicated an interest. So please look to the meeting summary for exactly that request of who's interested in which stakeholder requests. And then with that, Margie, I'll hand it back to you.
I would just also request that people be able, that your meeting summary include a way for people who weren't here or who missed a particular discussion to get in contact with those people who are prepared to hold that discussion. I know there are groups who could not stay this whole time.
Great. Yeah, we'll include a way for that. We'll perhaps either use ourselves to connect those people, have them volunteer, and then put them in touch. So that's great, London. We have a couple more hands raised. Let's Kelly, we haven't heard from you. Do you have a question that you'd like to pose here? Or let's go to Kelly first, then Glenn, and then we'll summarize. Kelly.
I just had a quick question. I wasn't familiar with Ben Elsley, and I was just curious who you work for.
Yeah, sure. So we're a consultant firm, Energy and Environmental Economics, otherwise known as E3.
Consulting with PNM or with GridWorks?
With PNM.
Okay, and so you're running the models, I assume?
No, we are not running the model. We are not running the models. PNM are doing that independently, and we're just here really just to offer strategic guidance on the stakeholder process.
And so what is that? What's the difference between what you're doing and what GridWorks is doing?
Well, I think GridWorks are kind of facilitating this process, and our advice really is to PNM directly in how to file an effective, compliant, IRP that hopefully makes stakeholders happy.
Are either one of you guys the independent monitor, or both of you guys the independent monitor?
No.
So Kelly, I'll let you refer you to Ben's introduction in this workshop. He stated what he and E3 do. They are a consultant in this process to PNM, as other consultants are supporting PNM to particular IRP. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it's helpful. Did he introduce himself in today's?
He did. Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Sure. Great. Glenn, did you have a last question?
Yes, which I posted in the chat, and maybe I could phrase a different way. Darren's questions made me realize that PNM can negotiate directly with the large loads as they did with Facebook. So my assumption would be that if they make a contract directly with a large load that falls outside of this IRP process, and it makes me think that the load projections are subject to scenarios where those projected load increases, I guess it was 85% attributed to large load, might not really materialize in the context of an IRP. And so I'm really asking, does that make sense? Because maybe we need a scenario for that.
Who are you asking your question of?
Ben might be able to answer it, or maybe PNM.
Yeah, I think that would be a question better for PNM, but maybe just to restate that, Glenn, before I hand it over. You're essentially saying if some of the large load is handled by kind of one-on-one agreements between PNM and ultimately the end-use customer, should it be omitted from the IRP process? Is that correct?
Well, and is it fundamentally legally outside of the IRP process? Yeah, it's sort of two parts.
Can we maybe pass it over to PNM?
And I think
Yeah.
Darren, PRC, also has weighed in the chat.
All right. Yeah, my view is that's outside something we can do in the IRP. It pretty much would require changes to the law and approval for a retail load to go out and not work with a local utility. How you would carve that out of the IRP is not something we can address.
Okay. Thank you.
Darren, can you elaborate for us that loads should be on the loads and resources table? All loads?
Well, that's kind of the current practice, because the current large load that we're talking about, the data center, is essentially a retail customer. So their load and their resources that they essentially bankroll are on the loads and resources table in general. But yeah, if, like Tom said, if somebody goes about it themselves and it isn't a customer, then yeah, that wouldn't essentially apply. But
Okay. Thank you. There's lots more to talk about. Let me just describe what's going to happen next. I really appreciate the conversation from this morning. And if Deb, you would please share slide number 9 from our deck. The process is that, of course, PNM is continuing to work very hard to get a base case model result that can be shared with everybody. We will work with PNM and notify folks when that gets posted on the Venue website. Also, you are able to go into Venue if you signed up for that access and make the alerts such that you get notified when new things are posted. But given this is such a critical piece of information, we will also let stakeholders know when that's posted. Our plan is changed just a little bit because of that. We're planning for the April 15th workshop, which we are strongly suggesting people attend in person. It's hybrid, be in Albuquerque. We'd like people there in person if possible, especially because all the model results at that point will be presented and discussed. And then in the afternoon, we continue this conversation about stakeholder requested modeling runs. Hope to bring those to closure. We're not sure when to announce the deadline for stakeholder requested runs because we don't know when the model results from the base case will be ready. But we are anticipating that that deadline for stakeholder requested runs will probably be after April 15th, but we're hoping to narrow down and define those during the April 15th workshop. The time change is noted here. we're suggesting that the 9 to 12, the morning conversation, be focused on model results. And then those who have an interest in shaping and refining the stakeholder requested modeling runs come back after having been served a lunch and spend 1 to 3 finalizing those modeling runs if we can. So that is our hope for April. Again, please come in person if you can, especially if you're interested in the stakeholder requested modeling run conversation, because that is a collaborative back and forth kind of discussion, augmented from what we had today. We will, of course, be putting working groups together between now and April 15th based on today's conversation with possible modeling run topics and people who would like to have input into that. And we will count on many of you to get together to have those conversations either live or by email to try to suggest those parameters. We can also talk to Ben and PNM about their ability to help coach and support the definition of those runs, but there's no specific plan for that right now. What happens now this week, though, before we get to April, if you have additional questions that have been not able to be asked or answered in today's conversation, please put them in an email to irp@pnm.com and to info@gridworks.org. We will get those answered, post them on our website, and organize an office hour on Friday. On Wednesday, I'm sorry, that office hour will be on the 25th of March for answering those questions and discussion on those. Then you can see the schedule for the remainder of the workshops here. So there are a lot of moving parts. Please turn in your questions by Friday of this week, and you'll see an announcement soon on an office hour for March 25th to follow up on those. Those answers will also be posted. Written responses will be posted on the GridWorks website. So that's where we are. We very much appreciate your understanding that modeling is challenging and we can't always predict when results will be available, but we are still working on the plan to be sure all your ideas for modeling run requests can be integrated into the conversation and the process. And with that, I think, Deb, if you could go to the next slide, please. We'll post a summary of this meeting, this workshop on our website, along with this summary of working group identified people who want to work on these topics. Please send questions by Friday, and then we encourage you to attend the workshop on April 15th. With that, let me stop and ask PNM, Thomas Dwayne, or Lori, or Shane, anything you would like to offer before we close today's workshop?
No, I will add, thank you very much. I think it's been a lot of good input on stakeholder scenarios. Appreciate everyone working together to try to make sure we're bringing forward meaningful scenarios as much as we can that serve multiple purposes. It's really helpful to the process. So thank you.
Yeah, and I share that. I think that the discussion today is useful in providing us directions where the focus of the stakeholders are and giving us the opportunity to think ahead on some of these things more. But we appreciate the discussion and the input we received and your participation in the process.
Great. Thank you again. Our last slide. Was there somebody else was going to speak? Go ahead. No. Kathy, anything you would like to add?
No, just really appreciate everybody's thoughts here and working to figure out what makes sense for the group for stakeholder requests. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We'll see you in Albuquerque at the CNM Workforce Training Center on the 15th, and look forward to conversations in between now and then. Thanks, and have a great day.